we decided to kind of take a step back, and out of the events surrounding, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, we wanted to reflect on, the really hard truths that surfaced, and also make sure that we were shaping a session really cognizant of all of the challenges that are facing tech and VC right now. So what to expect today? We've structured this webinar into 3 main sections. So we're going to start off by sharing a bit of our own analysis of the major trends that we're seeing impact how VCs and tech companies communicate in this environment, particularly in light of coronavirus and Black Lives Matter. Then we're going to hear from Amanda, who's going to spend some time digging into really like the baseline essentials of what leaders need to communicate in this new environment. And then we're going to finish off with often the most interesting part of the presentation, which is going to be a walkthrough of the questions that we've been hearing most frequently over the last 2 to 3 months, relevant to this peer group. And I'm aware we've got a really strong contingent of leaders in the VC and tech space tuning in from across the US and All Raises network. So please do submit any additional questions through the Zoom chat function, and we'll aim to spend at least the last 25 minutes covering those. So it goes without saying that the world has obviously changed fundamentally in 2020, but what does this mean for tech and VC firms and their communication strategies? See, there is no kind of one size fits all answer to the challenges and opportunities like that we've seen in 2020. But what we do know is that any strategy that you had before coronavirus is going to need to be reassessed and redrawn for a recovery period, which is going to likely be is going to likely include a recession, public health rebuilding, societal restructuring, and as we've become more familiar with, I'm sure, more political upheaval. So whenever we think about communication strategy, we think it's really important to start with research and evidence. I kind of wanted to cover like these 3 kind of building blocks, first of all. So firstly, kind of observing the discussion to see how it develops. At Milltown, we use a series of different digital tools to help us analyze trends in either general or specific conversations. So everything from a kind of neural language processing tool, Signal, that helps us understand what media are saying, through to social listening tool Brandwatch, and Icon, which helps us like plug into investor conversations. This gives us a really objective and accurate view of the main themes and issues within a certain debate. So if you're a VC or a tech company, you can perhaps use social listening by Brandwatch to gain insight into the evolving attitudes of online audiences and specialist audiences such as policymakers and journalists who are covering your beats and your sectors. Obviously, that's really useful at the moment. Alternatively, you can also set up public perception tracking, and that helps you understand how public sentiment is evolving. So, for example, if you're a biotech startup that's just received funding and you want to understand how public sentiment is evolving around your sector and the headline perceptions of your business, this is really useful. Secondly, armed with that data, it's really worth developing a hypothesis about where you think the conversation is going, so that you can work out, okay, how do these new circumstances that we find ourselves in actually percolate through the issue areas that are relevant to my business? And then you also need to interrogate that hypothesis to determine, will this have real implications on our comm strategy and how we communicate? One example of that would be, one meme that we've seen over the last few months is a real increased understanding in the trade-offs of collective data and privacy. As stakeholder understanding increases, that leaves us thinking, actually, if you have data governance practices and you haven't done a hygiene check of those practices and how you communicate about them, that's really, really important. And maybe you should prioritize that in the next few months and identify if it's like a positive territory that you can own as a business. Thirdly, who are the most important audiences for you to reach? This is obviously a key part of any communication strategy, and it's really important to tailor your message based on the evidence that you've gathered, and of course in line with your values and your mission as a business. So I wanted to take a bit of an opportunity to do a bit of scene setting. So firstly, on the left, we've been kind of tracking the conversation around coronavirus over the last few months. This was a quid graph looking, I think this goes up to the beginning of June, and we saw our analysis of the conversation it was really noisy, and it was really breathless. So this is an analysis of all the different media conversations around the search term coronavirus. And you'll see the different clusters of color that are all overlapping are separate conversations. And they're very disparate conversations taking place at the same time. So everything from the impact of health to the impact on the economy to the role of tech to finding a cure, or how tech is actually helping with the recovery long term. Basically, the main takeaway, there's no one major theme that is dominating the news. I think it's also worth me mentioning, when we were tracking this conversation last month, we started to see a bit of a downtick in interest from media and consumers in the conversation around coronavirus. However, what we've learned is there's absolutely no sitting on our laurels on this theme. As you've seen over the last week, with all of the headlines covering the recent resurgence in cases and hospitalizations, this conversation is not going away anytime soon. So having an understanding and being able to articulate how your company and firm is contributing to the recovery is really hugely important. So even though some of us might have a bit of COVID-19 fatigue at the moment, we really need to kind of set that aside and focus on how we can articulate this and wrap it into our communication strategies. Secondly, if we look specifically at VC coverage themes over a 3-month period, what you see here is a much more kind of evenly spread conversation, with an emerging theme being VC advice during COVID. So what we were seeing was people really wanted information and advice much more so than opinion. And actually what was a bit dangerous was articulating a definitive future view. And we saw a lot of VCs face a bit of pushback for making kind of hard predictions. So the kind of lesson there is articulating opinions always needs to be couched in a lot of nuance. Sounds obvious, but it's amazing how many times sometimes people make these missteps. In terms of sharing practical advice, we saw that kind of two ways. So VCs publicly sharing kind of tools and resources and following the kind of Y Combinator model for startups, and providing detail about the practical advice and support that they were providing. Again, this kind of accelerated a theme that we've seen over the last 5 years, which is VCs needing to kind of show their worth beyond simply capital. And then on the other flip side of that, we also saw established VCs were using the crisis to actually highlight their experience in previous downturns and using that to kind of parlay into credibility and differentiating them from the new entrants into the market. Then to the right of this slide, if we look at the media and policymaker conversation, what's been quite interesting is we've seen a bit of a dichotomy emerge. So as I'm sure you're all familiar, on the one hand, particularly technology companies, their core products and services have proven really valuable in helping societies to weather this crisis. And it's resulted in a bit of a deeper appreciation of the value that they create. On the other hand, even though there's that opportunity to correct the narrative around tech that we've seen over the last few years in terms of the pushback against tech and its role in society, we're also seeing from the conversations in the policy space that these proactive actions by companies could actually have the opposite effect of emboldening regulators to demand a similar level of proactivity afterwards. So also to say, any cooling effect on the media and regulatory scrutiny of tech companies during the pandemic is only likely to be temporary. Cool. So see, no conversation around the landscape right now can ignore the impact that Black Lives Matter has had on the world over the last few weeks. And I also want to say, this goes much deeper than a simple kind of comms issue. And I know it's something that people are kind of holding close to their hearts at the moment, and that people are facing and having really hard conversations at the moment and looking at their firms internally. And I think the kind of top line thought here is this is all just going to be determined by action and making kind of concrete action and commitments that match any kind of rhetoric. That said, I wanted to show a tiny bit of the color of how VCs and tech companies are being kind of perceived by the media at the moment in terms of what they're kind of coming out and saying in response to Black Lives Matter. So obviously brought diversity issues that were already simmering in tech and VC to the fore. The conversation among VCs on Twitter moved very sharply from kind of general chatter about performance, etc., through to the BLM movement, very rightly held conversations about racism, as well as calls for VCs to actually widen their talent pools and act against discrimination, with make the hire, send the wire emerging as a really dominant theme, as I'm sure we're all familiar. Being silent is obviously clearly unacceptable, but at the same time, I think it's really important to consider any statement from the viewpoints of your key constituents, and that includes your harshest critics. So definitely do the hard work internally first to ensure that any kind of concrete actions are as concrete as possible and that they match any kind of statement and commitment and promise that you're making at the moment. Finally, I wanted to kind of take a bit of a step back and look at what does this mean for the media landscape. So media are obviously a core audience in any communication strategy, and what have the last few months meant for them? So really quite interestingly, COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter have kind of played the role of accelerants and kind of exacerbated media trends that existed way before 2020. So on the one hand, we've seen local news continue to kind of get hit and, you know, collapsing in some parts of the US. And then conversely, we've seen ad spend being slashed at some of the big name publications. You know, New York Times, I think, reported a 50% drop off within a month of the crisis kind of hitting. Digital only, online only publications like Vice, Vox, Quartz, they've all been really hard hit and announced kind of mass redundancies and furloughs. We're not sure at what point the newsroom is going to kind of return to the normal, you know, return to business as usual, or if this is going to lead to a more kind of fundamental restructuring of how news is produced and disseminated. What we can say is whenever you're kind of crafting a pitch, it's really important to assume that reporters are not going to be covering the beats necessarily that they were before this crisis. There is a massive kind of consolidation of resource internally. And so it's really important to kind of like bring that into any media strategy that you're putting together right now. In terms of other trends that we've seen, so readership habits across digital, goes without saying that those have obviously grown. Everything is now happening online. People are spending way more time online than they ever have before. So subscription brands like the New York Times and the Financial Times have seen, you know, huge growth there. I think just in terms of like media responses to pitches at the moment, it's important to note that, you know, there was skepticism during, you know, the heat of COVID-19, and I'm sure we'll see that kind of hold strongly in the next few weeks, with reporters expressing, you know, fair annoyance at pitches by companies claiming to be solving COVID-19 unilaterally. So, and we're seeing similar dynamics play out actually around Black Lives Matter, where the bar for kind of commenting on issues and kind of sharing viewpoints is extremely high, and you should imagine kind of like deep scrutiny of any statement that you release right now. And like every industry, the media sector is facing itself really hard questions about race and diversity. So the social unrest has brought long simmering tensions back to a boil, from diverse hiring through to hard questions about how editors assign stories and who gets to kind of really succeed within their beats. This has led to a number of, you know, employee-led uprisings. I'm sure you may have seen some of the LA Times news this week. So a number of new roles are being created to report specifically on diversity stories, and equally like the people reporting on diversity and hiring are facing their own questions about how they've actually behaved over the last few years. It's really important for me to note, reporters are still writing about VC fundraising and deals, and there is absolutely still room for kind of good news in this environment. And we've seen that kind of play out with certain big kind of milestones over the last few weeks, have a lot of traction. And equally, there is lots of interest in the sectors that are kind of like weathering and seeing a lot of kind of growth during this crisis. So from healthcare and telemedicine through to e-commerce, reporters are still covering the kind of winners of coronavirus, and they're really interested in those stories still. That said, no pitch is ever shared in a vacuum, so please do evaluate the context when you're considering the role that media engagement is going to play in your strategy. And now I'm going to hand over to Amanda, who's going to walk through what this all means for leaders wanting to communicate right now.
Thank you, Francesca. Amanda Duckworth, and thank you to Milltown Partners and Allraise for inviting me to participate in this session. The context you just laid out, Francesca, obviously, I don't think any of us, and I'm probably a bit older than most people on this call, none of us have ever lived through something like this before. So we are certainly in uncharted territory, and really what it calls for is the type of leadership from companies that we've never, again, I don't think we've ever required so much of leaders in companies than we do today. And it will have real consequences. You may well have heard the expression before, never let a crisis go to waste. And there's a reason for that, because how you behave, the steps you take, the actions, the decisions you make, really will come to define a brand for years to come. I mean, we're asking CEOs and C-suites to make a set of very difficult decisions to steward the future of their companies. And they must make those decisions against a set of core values in order to do the right thing. And those who are able to demonstrate that they're sticking to principles to do the right thing will emerge even stronger. So if you can, I think you're driving, Francesca, if you can flip it forward. It's really difficult in these to present here a prescriptive blueprint for what each of you should do in this uncertain time. So instead, what we're really trying to walk you through today is more of a framework of principles that would inform communication strategies. And it's all about leadership. In fact, if we're successful today, and you'll be the judge of that, we will have equipped you with a framework that would help you through any issue or crisis, because these principles apply to whatever situation that you're dealing with. As I go through some of what we think of about as being incorporated in this notion of activating leadership via communications, know that the goals are, your goal is to really build trust with your stakeholders and to provide some level of direction, facts, all of which are reassuring as you are asking stakeholders to behave differently, to make different decisions that they may be unused to, and you're really trying to bring them along a continuum with you. We're going to touch on lightly on some of these things. I think the more valuable exercise is going to be in the Q&A section. We've developed some cues. You will have some cues, but I'm going to check through some things here that are these high-level framers of communication strategy. And perhaps obviously, it starts at the top. CEO has to be the chief messenger, owning the delivery of information. I will also say, I think the CEO has to be heavily involved in the concepting of communication and even the drafting of it. You'll see here to the side on the right, a little lift from a letter Brian Chesky sent a few weeks ago announcing layoffs at Airbnb. Brian actively was involved in the drafting of that note, and it shows. There is a level of openness and honesty and authenticity in it. It does not come across as a piece of corporate speak. And I think in times of crisis, people's radar is highly attuned to the BS factor. They're looking for something that feels very real and authentic. And so when you're working with leaders of your companies, involving them in the drafting of communication is really important. You are, as Brian here, if any of you have read that letter, you will know, I mean, it was very well received, not generally, but even by the people who were affected by the layoffs. There was a real openness and honesty about the situation that Airbnb was in. And that leads to the next point, which is, you just have to shoot straight with the facts. You can't be trying to fudge the truth. It will come back to bite you. There's another thing. The truth will out in the end, so you might as well start there. That there's no point in trying to mislead people. It never buys you anything. And so you really want to be shaping, again, this comes back to values and your culture. You want to be shaping the messages around that and really shooting straight with the truth. And again, it's related to looking to the long term when you talk about making commitments and what the future path of the company. Don't say anything you can't 100% own and deliver. There's an interesting example of a very large PR agency that in a very declarative fashion in March said we will not be making layoffs, and 2 months later they had to make some layoffs. It's more than just egg on your face. And I will say, by the way, I thought they recovered from it quite well. And I'm going to be discreet here. I'm not going to name who it is, but you don't want to be in a position where you're having to take something back, because it makes it look like, A, you've misled key stakeholders, and B, you, again, going back to this goal of trust, how is a stakeholder to know the next thing you say is going to be something they can rely on? So really critical that when you say you're going to do something, you honor it, and don't say something that you are uncertain if you can deliver on. This is a time, I think, when the governance principles that the Business Roundtable announced last year really come into their own. It's not just about shareholders. Communications has to be about all stakeholders. That's not to say investors are unimportant, but in this environment, employees, customers, local communities in which you work, your suppliers, your whole ecosystem, it needs to be kept in the loop and brought along. And I would even argue, I think there's some prioritization of audiences that makes a lot of sense today. And I would put employees and internal communications way at the top of the list. And where I would be focusing most of my time right now. I would also say this is more often than not in the communications business, less is more. In this particular period of time, I think more is more. The need not to go into a shell, even though there's not a lot of good news around. Keeping people in the loop with sort of a predictable cadence of communications, again, is essential to fostering that trust, and it provides that sense of leadership that I think people are craving. Before we go off this page, there is to the right, you will see another section from IDEO's recent communications on Black Lives Matter. And I wanted to put that there because their initial response was a little bit of a check the box, let's get something out there, feeling some pressure to say something. It backfired a little because it didn't feel, as we've discussed here, authentic and genuine. It felt a bit check the box without some substance, without some real meat to the bones. They came back with what I thought was just a really well-written piece of authentic communication around the actions that they plan to take. It was clear they put a lot of care and thought into that communication. So it points to a lot of the discussion items we've just been to, but it also underscores, you can make a mistake and you can recover from it with the right form of communication.
Great, thanks, Amanda. I think we're now going to shift to Q&A. So, I mean, I think as you covered there, the kind of questions and unique kind of challenges that a lot of the people who, have joined this webinar and that we work with as clients and in our network work, some of those questions veer from, what do you say to your teams right now, your customers, portfolio companies, or shareholders who are all experiencing COVID-19 in different ways, and like you said, at different times. I guess kind of to start with, Amanda, as you know, we're more than 3 months into the pandemic, and also in the midst of perhaps, one of the biggest civil rights movements in our lifetime. How do you kind of approach the question of balancing communicating good news, such as fundraising, and big kind of product launches, with the negative news that we're seeing almost daily?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. And maybe this is a semantics issue, but the concept of balancing troubles me a little, because it suggests like there's some sort of assets and liabilities balance sheet in our head of, well, if we're going to put out some bad news, we better have a commensurate set of good news to go with it. And it feels like that's not the right prism to push this through. I mean, bad news just has to be dealt with, and as we said earlier, with straightness and straightforwardness and openness. Certainly this is not to suggest if you have good news you don't make the most of it. But I think it's not about balance, it's just about dealing with what you have to deal with. And if in this period of time, there's unfortunately, when you do your mapping, and analysis, if there's something a little more on the negative side of the balance sheet, that will be what it is. If you've had layoffs or a new product launch to cancel, I think you just, again, it's this straightforwardness and openness that has to guide communications, rather than aiming for a particular look or optics. I mean, the press are so preoccupied with what's going on. There's not a lot of appetite to hear about things other than how companies are dealing with COVID and racial issues and workplace issues, and rebalance, looking at inclusion and diversity policies. I also think, a product announcement is a tough thing to do in this environment, and if you can wait a little, my view would be you're probably better served to get beyond the intensity of the moment that we're in right now, where people have the bandwidth and the ability to pay attention to it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, that's also something that we've kind of, we grapple often with at Milltown, is, a kind of client comes to us with an analysis that, for all intents and purposes, is like really solid and concrete, but it's really important to like help them and kind of guide them through the fact that journalists are reporting on, hospitalizations across the US. So even if you have a really exciting like healthcare product that is maybe trying to tackle like part of the issue, like you're competing against like national daily news, and it's not the same kind of calculus as pre-COVID, when you would have a bit more kind of like currency with those reporters, and you'd just be able to kind of like feed them news and expect that they might cover it. So yeah, I think that's a really important kind of principle to flag. I guess like one other question that I know is going to be on people's minds at the moment is, and like I said, like kind of Black Lives Matter, we're kind of right in the heart of it right now, and we're all kind of feeling it, and trying to work out how can we kind of contribute to meaningful progress. And even though we haven't got all of the answers, how do we, leverage comms to show that there is that good intention and that we want to kind of make kind of concrete changes. I'd be kind of curious for your views on like the best way of leveraging comms right now to show kind of concrete action. I mean, from my perspective, it feels like it has to be led by action, and listening, and like really, really listening has to play a part. So like listening to your stakeholders, whether that's employees or whether that's the, LPs that you like invest on the behalf of, whether that's your portfolio companies, like really listening to people's experiences during this moment, and then working out what can we reasonably contribute to this conversation, and are we just communicating for the sake of it, or do we have an opportunity to contribute something really meaningful and make hard policy changes that go way beyond rhetoric? And I feel like that's the kind of approach that is kind of better to take right now, but kind of keen for your views on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with all of that. And I think I said earlier, I think some companies have slipped up on rushing to get out a statement saying they were obviously supportive of change and wanting to see change, but without actually saying how they would contribute to change. It felt very empty. So better to say, in my view, and people can take issue with this, better to say nothing than to say something that's empty. And so if it takes time to figure out what you could say that is meaningful and substantive, then take the time. I mean, it seems to me one of the things that a lot of companies have are embracing, and it's the listening, it's the talking, but in the action category, really being able to help with the pipeline issue. I mean, that's where it started on the gender diversity issues of the last few years, where companies committed to, at the internship level, to really train people and include them that way to get them on that first rung of the ladder. But then also, not from an allocation standpoint, or but committed to hiring policies and practices that changed the profile of the firm and the diversity of the firm. But there have to be, I mean, some may think it's meaningful and substantive to write checks to various organizations to help fund their works. And I think that's probably true. It's helpful. But I think things won't change a whole lot unless we change it in the workforce. For there to be greater representation. And so everybody's going to have a different solution and approach, but it goes back to what you said, Francesca. It's really got to be, a communication has to be built around substance and not just empty words.
Yeah. I think one interesting kind of conversation that we've seen develop as well is like also when talking about it, not assuming that it's something that's going to be able to be like fixed overnight. And
right.
It's not just a trend that's emerged over the last 3 months, but as everyone on this call I'm sure will agree, it kind of goes back like so long. And so even though sometimes there is a tendency, particularly in tech, to think that you can almost solve things as like an engineering problem and kind of solve things really quickly as long as you kind of get the right team together, I think it's really interesting to see some of the kind of opposite side of that debate, which is like, it's great that we are having this conversation now and we need to invest everything in it, and we need to make sure that like we kind of continue the momentum and like build the movement, and that it doesn't ever like peter out. But equally, we also need to be like realistic about what it is that we need to change, and like how long that will take, and how this movement needs to like have continual support long before, long after media are kind of covering it very frequently. So I think it's been, I guess, like very encouraging to see how much it has like galvanized even just in 2 weeks in the tech and VC space. But equally, it will be really interesting to see how we kind of continue to maintain this momentum going forwards.
Well, if there's a lesson from the focus on gender over the course of the last 3 to 5 years, it is that the media will come back and ask, what have you done? And they will want to see the statistics and to see if there's been any change.
Yeah, absolutely. One other question, which I'm sure we've kind of all been feeling in like different ways, and I know we've been kind of holding the hands of kind of clients on this particular kind of communications challenges around layoffs and communicating obviously really, really tough news to employees. I wanted to kind of get your view on, do you feel that expectations around layoffs has kind of changed, and what's kind of altered that, and any kind of like first principles that you think people need to keep in mind?
Yeah, so what has obviously changed is there have been a lot of layoffs. And so it's not quite the same shock factor as it might have been 6 months ago. I mean, I say this sadly, not to suggest this is a positive, but it's just a fact that I think the environment, we've all become a bit more conditioned to it because we've seen the headlines of so many companies. But what hasn't changed, I think, is that you still need the same sensitivity and empathy around these announcements, recognizing that you are changing people's lives. I mean, letting somebody go in the middle of a pandemic and a dire economy and a time of unprecedented racial unrest is not going to be the easiest time for people to find places of employment. So I do think that there is a heightened need for good severance agreements. Generosity goes a long way here, and support for those people, helping them to find other places of employment. To give you a specific example, the agency I referenced earlier, not by name, but I thought was very clever in reaching out to their alumni network to ask those people if they could employ some of the folks who are being laid off from this agency. So, digging deep, really trying to help these people, and to understand that it's also hard for the folks left behind. The employees who keep their jobs, that there's sort of almost a guilt factor. It's like the folks who survive plane crashes and live for the rest of their lives wondering, why did I make it and the guy next to me didn't? Maybe not quite as severe as that, but it's the same. You get the concept that there is also a need to be very understanding of the people who are still going to come back to work when many of their colleagues have been let go.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I've also kind of jumping off what you were saying there around, and also what you were saying earlier around like the expectations around CEOs and leaders during this time, because they'll be grappling with those issues and, approaching how to let go like 25% of the workforce is not something that they were planning to do at the beginning of this year. And yet they're having to navigate that very uncharted territory, often in a kind of like public forum. And what has been kind of, I guess, like gratifying to some extent is to see how much people are like knowledge sharing and like sharing best practices. And, the example that we flagged on this slide with Henry Ward, where he was like, this is how we had to deliver these conversations. I'm sure I didn't get it quite right, but here are some reflections on that process that I hope other CEOs and leaders can kind of reflect on forward. So I think it's really, I guess like one hopeful element of the last few months is that we are kind of constantly like up leveling the boats of how we treat our employees and how we speak to them going forward.
Yeah.
So I guess you spoke a lot about kind of leadership comms and, you know, the kind of commonalities. I'd be very curious for your view on like the commonalities around like what we think is really effective right now in terms of leadership, and if you think anyone has really emerged you know, during this period as someone that we can kind of embody and learn from. And I'm sure, you know, particularly all the VCs that we have tuning in now who are kind of considering, you know, to what extent do I deploy execs and partners right now, and what kinds of profiles should we be seeking to build, and what should we be saying? What are the best practices there, do you think?
Yeah, I do think there are commonalities among leaders who are being effective. And by the way, they're not newly found traits. I think these leaders have embodied these traits for as long as they've been leaders. And one is that they have always understood the importance of communications, and they've attached priority to it, and that people leading the charge on communications in those companies have a seat at the table. That they're involved with it. They don't just say, hey, I need a statement here, or I need an email to send out to employees, but they invest time either, you know, in some instances writing it themselves, particularly if it's tough news, because they want their words to be expressed in the communication, but certainly help if they're not going to do that, certainly helping the communications folks understand what's important to them and what's on their mind. So they know comms is important. They're invested in the process. Sorry, something just dropped off my wall there. God. They take time to prepare for something. I mean, you know, if there's an important all hands or a call of some kind where tough news is going to be delivered, these people never wing it. They rehearse it, they're prepared, they've gone through not only what they're going to say, they've prepared for all the tough questions that they're likely to get asked. So it's just, I think it really ladders up to, they just get it. They understand the importance of this, and they are willing to really commit time and energy to it. And, you know, I hate to go back to Brian Chesky, but, you know, I worked with Brian back in the 2011 through about 2013, 2014. And I have to tell you, from the earliest days of Airbnb, it was just obvious to me. He really understood instinctively what it took to be a good communicator. That said, he invested time to really learn and he from others what constitutes best practices. And I think you've seen it consistently over the years that he really is, he stands tall in the valley in terms of being a good communicator.
Yeah, it feels in terms of like building a profile as like a really human founder. He's done he's made like brilliant progress there. I mean, like you said, it's kind of building on years of him like really investing in communications, but equally, even just seeing the regular videos that he broadcasts right from his like living room, it just brings you right into the challenges that he's going to be facing as someone running a business. I think what's quite interesting is as well, I think, is just like how much like leaders and CEOs have been like ramping up their communications, particularly with employees, like you said, that being such an important constituent for them. And I think even to your point around like layoffs, even if you're a company that's not necessarily making layoffs, like equally you're going to have a ton of employees who are extremely concerned, probably overworking during this time to kind of prove their worth and value. And there are really distinct like well-being issues there. And, you know, assuming that this environment isn't going to change anytime longer, you also need to kind of keep your employees really motivated and involved, and know that and help make sure that they feel like supported and like really valued during this time. So it's been really interesting, even as a firm ourselves, to see kind of founders and partners like really stepping up to ensure that they're like regularly communicating, like ramping up the one-to-one conversations that they're having with employees, really like listening to their needs. You know, one client I work with, I remember it was around the time of like May or June, and she was setting up one-to-one conversations with every single customer across her base. Incredibly time consuming, but absolutely the right thing to do. So it's been really great to see how much like they have kind of like stepped up and taken the reins on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, on the employee point you just made, I know a lot of leaders have reached out to folks who haven't lost their jobs, they're still working, but in this remote working situation that we're all in right now, days become, days blend into one another. The morning starts at 6 a.m. and it ends at midnight, and there's no difference between the working week and the weekend. I mean, people are working much harder. I mean, I've heard that consistently, and the need for CEOs to acknowledge that and really be grateful for the support that employees are showing to their companies.
Yeah, definitely. I guess like one other like challenge that leaders and kind of comms leaders might be facing as well is, you know, in parts of the US, we've kind of come out of lockdown. Others, there are still kind of severe containment measures going on. Like how do you kind of communicate that and ensure that you're kind of debating the risks in the right way and the benefits of returning to work, and kind of keeping employees kind of educated and informed along the way? Because like you said, these are really huge decisions that are impacting people's lives, you know, all from people who fundamentally might just not enjoy working at home, others who really miss the office, through to others having to make, you know, long-term decisions about their living arrangements and kind of staring into a bit of a void. I mean, one thing that I know we advise companies, but we're a company ourselves. And I think one thing that's worked very well is making sure that, you know, we're a relatively small firm of around like 80 people, but making sure we're surveying all of the needs and kind of listening to actually like, how do people kind of find their working at home experience? Do they want that to shift? And to what extent, you know, what is actually influencing those decisions, so we can see if we can kind of help them navigate those, as we ourselves as like leaders of the company are also trying to maintain a kind of consistent level of like work over the next like few months. So I think that kind of combination of making sure people feel really heard, but equally ultimately you have to make a decision that is in line with your values, responds to their needs, but also makes sense for the business as a whole. Do you think there are any kind of principles that have emerged around how companies like talk about return to work at all?
I think it's very data driven too. It's all the things you just said, but I also think it's based on the facts as they're known. This is the one thing we haven't said today, and we probably should, is how collaborative communications needs to be in this current environment work. I mean, it always is, it has to be, but I think today the need to be closely aligned with HR, and in this particular instance of coming back to work with facilities, on how, what's the workplace, not only when is it going to open, but what's the office going to look like? Will everybody be coming back at the same time, or is there going to be more of a shift system set up? How do people deal if people have to take public transportation? I mean, I know there's real nervousness around that. So it's got to be data driven, and communication has to be built off the input from HR and facilities and other folks that are really thinking through very carefully what the new workplace looks like. And flexibility is key. I think if you can give people options, where someone who doesn't particularly want to take BART every day, they live in the East Bay, they're coming into the city, and they would prefer to work from home. I think you have to be prepared to be flexible. And if there's one positive that's come out of this whole situation, it's that remote work and distributed workforces can remain effective. People may be killing themselves, as I said earlier, but the work is getting done. And so flexibility is also key.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been really interesting. I'm sure particularly for like international firms where you're doing that original like survey and research, and it probably like throws up some very interesting kind of like attitudes to remote working. I know here in the US, we were surprised with actually when we saw the survey results, how many people actually thoroughly just enjoy working from home and would be quite sated with a more kind of flexible return to work schedule, as long as they were kind of building in time to see colleagues outside of work in kind of open spaces. So I think also just like you said, challenging your assumptions and making sure that you're really treating comms, like you said, as a listening device and working with all sides of the business to get to the right outcome makes complete sense.
Yeah.
How, I guess kind of related to this, how much guidance about the future do you think that companies should be giving in this moment?
Well, I think you have to be very careful here. It goes back to the point, don't make commitments you're not 100% certain you can honor. Now, of course, when I looked at that question, when you first raised it, my mind immediately went to guidance in the context of public companies and financial information. And I know there aren't any public companies on the call here today, but just leveraging from that, I can't think of one company that's giving forward-looking guidance right now on earnings and financial performance, because it's just too uncertain, and there'd be a shareholder lawsuit sooner than you could say Jack Robinson. But I think some of that still applies to private companies as well on financials, and just be very careful about saying too much about future performance, because it's really unknown. Beyond financials, I mean, I think clearly people want to know, they want to hear something from you, and I think it should be focused on what are you doing? What are the actions you're taking? Where is your focus right now? So that it's about today as opposed to predicting tomorrow. And I think that's the better course of valor in communications right now.
Yeah. I mean, related to that, do you feel things like product marketing initiatives, do they need to be completely off the table, or kind of like actually it makes complete sense and we can kind of wrap that into a communication strategy right now?
I think, and I think reasonable people can disagree on this. And I think this is an area of some controversy, but for me, it feels like the bar is very high for a new product to clear, to be launched in this environment, in large part because I worry that the message will fall on deaf ears. That the people are so distracted and focused elsewhere. Now, that said, if it's a product that could contribute to the current environment, and particularly if you're in the healthcare business and you have something, as you talked about, mental well-being for workers, then maybe there's more receptivity to a product launch. But I think it really has to be put through the ringer, and some tough questions about, does this make sense in the current environment?
Yeah, definitely asking the question, does this actually constitute news in the current cycle, is a really important one. I think that actually really lines up with the final question, which was focused on, like, if you're a VC or a tech company and kind of leading comms at either, does engaging with the press right now risk sounding completely tone deaf, and should you kind of stay silent? I'd be keen kind of for your views there, Amanda. I think my sense is that you do have to obviously avoid any sense of ambulance stories, and we covered earlier in the presentation that reporters are really savvy to any company that's just trying to kind of take advantage of a moment and trying to kind of insert their narrative into a debate. But equally, you know, there is still an imperative, right, for needing to kind of get news out there if it does constitute news. I think one piece of advice that we've been giving some clients is kind of there are weeks where it doesn't make sense to reach out to reporters, but equally you do still need to kind of build your core group of reporter fans and balance that against obviously using your exact times really judiciously. But like if you do have news, like starting small, identifying the reporters that really cover your beat, really understanding the world that they're in and what they're covering, and you can still do that relationship building at the moment, even if you're not kind of chasing hard news and hard coverage. So that's like one potential approach. But yeah, keen for your thoughts, although also aware we have 1 minute left.
Okay, I agree with what you said. No, and I do. I mean, I think it's really about preserving relationships as opposed to pitching and trying to get coverage.
Great. Well, I hope we covered the main questions that people had. Hey, Marion. I guess just to really conclude very quickly, there's obviously no single roadmap, right, for guaranteed success in comms today. Like you walked through, Amanda, and we're undoubtedly in really uncharted waters. So where you can kind of play in experience, instinct, and agility, and make sure that you have those skills at your disposal as comms leaders right now is hugely important. But also to say, comms has never played a more larger role, which is both exciting and it can be daunting at times. But I hope that this presentation has been informative and useful. And Amanda, thanks so much for sharing your opinions with us today.
No, thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone who attended. It is 1 o'clock, and we appreciate both you, Fran and Amanda, and I have posted a post-survey feedback link in the chat. If you could take a minute to fill it out, we'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.